eventually Russia will collapse if it continues on this path, and it will collapse spectacularly. And all the analysts and politicians around the world would be saying, oh, we told you so, that the economy of Russia and the political system was not very, very good, but for now it does look like there is a fortress Russia, but I don't think there is. I think they are bluffing, and Ukraine has to hold its ground, and it will. And Russia eventually will withdraw, or we will stop. And this cost of millions of people killed and wounded will come back to bite Russia. We remember that a lot of organized crime has been created by these Afghan soldiers coming back in the Soviet Union, and that's where Russian mafia of the 90s has been created and has drawn its soldiers. So now the situation will be 100 times worse, and that will create all kinds of domestic political issues and pressure on businesses, and will affect the economy. So Russia is gonna face serious trouble, and there will be consequences of this strategic mistake and awful tragic decision that Putin has decided to invade Ukraine only in order to stay in power. He will prolong his staying in power, but he is basically pushing Russia back decades, if not more.
Tymofiy Mylovanov is president of Kyiv School of Economics and former Minister of Economy of Ukraine. Welcome to our program, Mr. Mylovanov.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I would like to begin our discussion with US-led negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, and later we can also cover economics and energy situation in Ukraine. US Special Envoy Steven Witkoff said that we could expect some good news in the upcoming weeks. He has been making this over-optimistic statements for a while about these negotiations. What is your assessment of current state of this diplomatic process, and how close are we to any kind of deal?
So, okay, my view, my very honest view is actually split into competing views. One is, as every Ukrainian, and I hope every good human in the world, I hope the war will be over soon. So, I'm waiting, I'm expecting, I'm hoping that these negotiations will be effective. And I think there's actually quite good news. The fact that people are talking to each other. This is, Russians and Ukrainians and Americans and even Europeans, maybe through some of back channeling. For example, there was a visit. Some of this back channeling is actually publicly available, because you've seen that President Macron released information, or the government allowed to release information, that French politicians traveled to Russia to speak with Russians. So there's a lot of negotiations going on. It's much more than before. And, that's a preliminary stage. So I think there is a hope, since the negotiations and conversations continue, that something will happen. On the other hand, I think I'm pessimistic that it will happen immediately. Because, I remember Mr. Trump, President Trump's 24 hours promise, then multiple deadlines, sometimes to President Putin, sometimes to President Zelensky. And now there's this June deadline. But, the history shows that, for example, in the North-South Korea environment, it took 2 years to reach some negotiations. So some outcome. So it might take a long time, in my view. So I'm optimistic as a human, and I'm a little bit more realistic as an analyst and an economist and an expert in game theory. So I think it will take a long time before we see the results, but it is definitely possible in 2026.
Don't you think that US is putting more pressure on Ukraine rather or on Russia right now?
So it is true that the U.S. plays with the card, to paraphrase President Trump, that they've got, and their cards over Russia are limited. I think they are trying to use this future deals kind of card with Russia, but I think that this is not very effective, because Russia, President Putin is not interested in another 10 or $100 billion to himself. If he were, he would not have started this war. He effectively controls the country, and he has access to all of its wealth, and they are spending actually, hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and they have spent more than $1 trillion already over the 4 years, directly and indirectly even more. So they are signaling, they are clearly demonstrating that wealth is not a concern. So what the U.S. is trying to offer to them is, unfortunately, is not very effective for Russia, and not very relevant. Russia wants to be recognized as an imperial power, as a great power, but they haven't got the economy and even influence. At most, they can fight for Donbass in Ukraine, so that's very limited. It's very threatening to Europe, but in fact, it is indeed very limited. So Russia has aspirations which the U.S. cannot offer anything to satisfy, and at the same time, the United States doesn't have much leverage, or is unwilling to use leverage over Russia, because in principle, it could have crushed it both politically and economically, and even militarily by supporting Ukraine properly. So the U.S. is unwilling to do that. On the other hand, yes, the U.S. can threaten Ukraine, and is also unwilling to support Ukraine financially. So it uses sticks mostly by threatening to cut off intelligence, to prohibit Europeans from supplying American tech, or European tech using American tech to Ukraine. But I think all of that is also very, very limited in effectiveness, because President Trump, can, talk about this, but I think as midterms approach, and as he is facing challenges from the Supreme Court on the tariffs and from the ICE blocked operations in Minnesota in particular and elsewhere, his support, or his political constraints domestically are increasing, and so his ability to drop Ukraine will be limited. So he also has a small window before the midterm elections that he can use threats, but that these threats are not as effective as one might think.
You just mentioned that U.S. can crush Russia militarily and economically. How could this look like by imposing secondary sanctions tariffs against India's Turkish, Chinese oil refineries?
Well, there are multiple things, you can do, from generating cyber attacks, which leads to bank runs. For example, you can attack a pension fund, and so pensions won't be delivered, to, printing money and delivering them through organized crime or like back channels to Russia to create a hyperinflation fear. That's a sort of more of a guerrilla warfare, adventure warfare, or you can target all Russian assets and all Russian individuals operating for the state in Europe, in the United States, and in other countries where the U.S. has leverage. You can target networks. You can target indeed secondary. There's so much more. Like if really the U.S. puts its the U.S. is very powerful. The U.S. can prosecute apparently its own citizens in violation of its own constitution when it fights immigration. So it definitely can prosecute Russians explicitly and implicitly, openly and covertly, judicial and extrajudicially, all around the world. So if it wanted to do that, it could run all kinds of operations and target all kinds of critical officials everywhere, economically and physically or legally. And all of that would create sufficient pressure on Russia. But it simply has chosen to work with the carrots, but the carrots are limited.
You just mentioned about these carrots. Why does President Trump hesitate to put more pressure on Putin? Because he cannot risk his so-called friendship with Russian dictator Putin?
No, I don't think it's about friendship. I actually think that's a typical U.S. behavior. It's not really their war. I think they're on the right side of the war, but they don't want to pay the cost for it. If you remember, the United States entered the war, World War II, only after the U.S. Excuse me. If you remember, the United States entered the World War II only after the Pearl Harbor, really, this is basically the behavior, and in some sense, it's very strategic and optimal for the United States. Why should they care, their cost? Why should they pay the cost of the war if it's not really their war? The difference between, I think, President Trump and President Biden is that President Trump has been very open about it. He basically says it in your face, says it's not our war, whereas President Biden said all the right things, but still delays support. Remember all these discussions discussions about whether it is possible to use javelins in the beginning of the war or to supply some kind of any kind of missiles, F-16s, Patriots. Remember, Patriots was a discussion at some point, a long discussion whether it's going to be an escalation, if the U.S. provides air defense to Ukraine. So, Trump also talks a lot of this sort of friendly to Russia language, but in reality, he imposed sanctions and he didn't stop supplies to Ukraine. It is true that he doesn't want to pay for it, but if others are willing to pay for it, he's supplying weapons. So I think it's a very clear and in some sense a very honest behavior, although we might not like it. And also a lot of people will consider it to be unethical and very realistic and pragmatic. But I think this is also consistent with the overall U.S. foreign policy with respect to Europe in particular as well. If we look at NATO, or if we look at the situation with Greenland.
There have been lots of discussions about this team of negotiators, Steven Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and a lot of people call them not really competent enough to conduct such high-stakes diplomacy. What is your assessment of this business deals approach to negotiations?
That's how the president is. The president of the United States now thinks in terms of deals, even if he also thinks strategically. He achieves this strategy, implements this strategy through a lot of business-like approach. I do think that in some areas it might be effective. I also think it opens itself to an attack, as you just said, that, these people are not really diplomats. But also we know that diplomats or the standard diplomatic approach has not achieved much. So, I think it makes sense to try, from their perspective at the very least. I can see how it makes a lot of sense to try something different. But there's also a saying that the United States will do the right thing only after it tries to do every wrong thing. So in my view, that's not going to lead to an effect. It's more like the old Reagan foreign policy, kind of Cold War, containment, pressure on Russia. This is what really works. This is what Russia understands. And this is why it has been successful in containing the Soviet Union. And that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. Nothing else historically has worked against the Soviets or Russia. But, the U.S. has its right to make these mistakes. It's unfortunate that these mistakes will mean that a lot of people will die in Ukraine and Europe too. But, the world is what it is, I think.
You just also mentioned this Soviet Union's experience and main reasons behind the collapse of this Soviet regime. However, Soviet Union has sustained probably 15,000 casualties in this war in Afghanistan. However, Russia has already lost 1.2, 1.3 million soldiers dead and wounded. Why didn't this work as well as with Russian side as this worked with Soviet Union?
Yeah, so I think it is a shocking and very paradoxical experience that is very different from the last war. I mean, it's not quite true because Russia has also waged wars on Chechnya and in other areas, on Georgia. But yes, Afghanistan is a very well-known case that eventually the mothers of fallen soldiers created pressure from inside. But remember also at the same time, that was sort of the end of the Soviet Union and the economy was not doing well. And there was a lot of pressure coming from the Reagan policies, in fact, on trying to speed up the arms race to make it excessively financially prohibitive for the Soviet Union. I think we all of us, including me, we have underestimated the ability of Putin to suppress the bad news and to put his population in fear. It's not very different from Stalin, although Putin is not really kind of responding with Gulag's kind of pressures. But FSB has terrorized and has instilled fear in Russians. So people are afraid and people are quiet. But I still think, and I'm convinced, and the history I think will prove me right, that this ability to accept accept losses is not unlimited. Eventually, Russia will collapse if it continues on this path, and it will collapse spectacularly. And all the analysts and politicians around the world would be saying, "Oh, we told you so that the economy of Russia and the political system was not very, very good, But for now, it does look like there is a fortress Russia, but I don't think there is. I think they are bluffing, and Ukraine has to hold its ground, and it will. And Russia eventually will withdraw, or we will stop. And this cost of millions of people killed and wounded will come back to bite Russia. We remember that a lot of organized crime has been created by these Afghan soldiers coming back in the Soviet Union, and that's where Russian mafia of the 90s has been created and has drawn its soldiers. So now the situation will be 100 times worse, and that will create all kinds of domestic political issues and pressure on businesses, and will first of all will affect the economy. So Russia is gonna face serious trouble, and there will be consequences of this strategic mistake and awful tragic decision that Putin has decided to invade Ukraine only in order to stay in power. He will prolong his staying in power, but he is basically pushing Russia back decades, if not more, in development. And Russian people will pay a very high price, not only directly, but indirectly through what all this deaths and kills and culture of war crimes will do to Russia once all the soldiers come back.
What is your honest assessment of the state of Russian economy? Because Russian oil prices have fallen to their lowest levels since the pandemic, and they have large problems with Russian oil revenues right now.
So when economists say that Russian economy is not doing well, they mean it. There are structural problems. There's GDP growth is not high, or sometimes it's hidden that it's actually falling. But in terms of military effect, it doesn't really matter that much. So there's a difference between a crisis and the economy is not doing well. When we say GDP, let's say, is going down by 5%, that means, and it's evenly spread across the entire economy. What it means is that, for example, we are not producing 900 missiles, we produce 95. You still can fight with that, So when economists are saying that the Russian economy is not doing very well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot fight. I think people sometimes confuse that. In order to generate an inability of the Russian state to function, you have to generate a crisis. And the crisis is generated by the lack of trust. So as long as Russian people believe that Putin is in control and he will get through the war, then economy will be doing more or less okay. It might not be doing well economically, but they will continue to fight. But the moment they believe that he has lost his track, that he cannot deliver the results, that it looks like they will be stuck for another 4 years without any real difference, then there will be a crisis, and it will severely limit the ability of the state to function. We know that Russia changes power, and this change of power is non-democratic, but always spectacular and associated with deep crisis. And I think something like that is going to happen in Russia. I don't know when, but I think I put a very high probability that basically if negotiations do not lead to some kind of ceasefire and peace, then the future of Russia will be determined by a major internal domestic political crisis, partly caused by the lack of trust in leadership.
Let's also cover the situation in Ukraine, and let's begin with the state of Ukrainian economy. What is your global assessment of the state of Ukrainian economy? And also, second question would be about current negotiations with International Monetary Fund about this 8 billion loan under discussion right now, and this demand from IMF to put high taxes on individual and entrepreneurs in Ukraine.
So basically, I think on the IMF side, everything will be fine. There'll be some bargaining about where the reforms or their demands will take place. It's a political issue in many, many ways. It will hurt some industries, it will help others. So it's a redistribution. Taxation is always politically controversial and might hurt some parts of the economy and substantive parts of the economy, but some may benefit others. So I think, but that issue will be somehow sorted out. overall, I think the Ukrainian economy is doing very well given the situation it is in. But of course, it requires international support, which is forthcoming with this 90 billion euro support package. But of course, there is Hungary currently trying to block it. But I think also that will be overcome. So I'm not too concerned here. I think the bigger concern is the morale of civilians and this critical attacks on energy infrastructure, and that a lot of apartments in Ukraine have been frozen. So we'll see how that affects the economy. But the good news here is that the spring is coming, and this effect is relatively limited, at least in time.
Let's also focus more on this introduction of possible value-added tax for self-employed entrepreneurs with probably annual revenue about 1 million hryvnia. I mean, how we call this in Ukraine for FOPs, right, for individual businessmen. Do you support this decision to introduce VAT on their revenues?
Well, so on the one hand, there are classic economic arguments why it should be done to remove the sort of shadow market, because a lot of people, or a lot of companies actually, not people, abuse this, and so that's a kind of loophole. On the other hand, the argument is that it's not going to be possible to do well, and therefore it will push even more legitimate businesses under sort of in the shadow economy, and it will hurt legitimate businesses. I think this is a good idea only if administration of the taxation works well, and everyone, every single person plays by the same rules. And I think that actually is a much better and much more important deal than VAT. Administration, removing corruption, making sure that the courts and the police and customs and tax authorities are clean. And so that requires a different culture, an approach towards change of mentality. For example, if we compare it with the United States with ICE operations, we haven't seen ICE operations really targeting and shutting down businesses. We have seen ICE operations shooting people, which is a violation of constitution, but we have not seen them touching businesses. So they value, and the new administration in the United States value business above the individual rights. Which is amazing. But in Ukraine, the business rights are really very, very low. They're like the moment there is something at least potentially wrong with your business, police or tax authorities or law enforcement can come in and shut down your business, and then you will be proving that you are okay for the next 6 months or sometimes 2 years. And that's really bad for business climate. And I think so the sort of the IMF and the government are kind of discussing a problem about VAT, but in my view this is secondary problem. The real problem is to change the mentality of law enforcement and to create a sense of respect for business, because it's business which creates value added, creates taxes, and creates jobs, and so keeps the economy afloat and develops something. So we need to first think about supporting business, and the big problem is with the law enforcement, I think.
Don't you think that Ukrainians would have to pay more for goods and services in case of this VAT tax being introduced?
Well, yes. So I think any tax increases pricing, but it also creates higher revenues, and these revenues are needed for the war. So, there's always a trade-off, because you can make this argument in the other direction. Let's abandon VAT, but then we don't have money for military. So, this is the situation where there's no good answer. It's like with Tkiie, do they have to do this to people and be harsh? Well, that's not right, but do they need to get people to military? Yes. So or you take any other example where what should be the price for electricity? On the one hand, we want it to be very low, that people are supported. On the other hand, because when it's very low, no other companies come in, no private companies come in, and as a result, we see that there's not enough electricity in Kyiv after, for example, or in Odessa or in Dnipro after bombings. So there unfortunately, we're in the war situation where there are no easy choices. On the one hand, Ukraine needs to support its entrepreneurs and people. Therefore, increasing VAT is a bad idea. On the other hand, it needs more taxes, even if it means that in the future that sort of hurts the economy because it needs taxes now to survive the Russian invasion. So therefore, it wants to increase taxes. And I don't think there is an easy answer to that.
And most final topic for our discussion, energy crisis in Ukraine. What is your assessment of the situation with energy grid right now, and for how long would it take for Ukraine to recover and to repair all this energy stuff hurted and attacked by Russian side?
So Russia is very strategic and systematic in destroying the Ukraine centralized system of electricity production, generation, and transmission. And I think the solution to that, in many ways, the market and people will adjust by the decentralization of production. So there'll be a lot of heating stations, electricity stations, alternative energy generation all around Ukraine. And so it's not so much that Ukraine will be rebuilding what it was done, because a lot of these power plants, that's simply impossible to rebuild. It will be building something new. And so I think that will be the adaptation.
Thank you, Mr. Mylovanov, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.